Welcome to the One Mind Dharma podcast. My name is Matthew Sokolov, and if you want to learn more about us, you can visit oneminddharma.com. To schedule individual sessions, you can visit themindfulcounselor.me or head to oneminddharma.com and click coaching. We have our meditation challenge back up for free, oneminddharma.com/challenge. And we have the New Year event, which is offered on a sliding scale donation basis. No one will be turned away for lack of funds. And it'll be almost said 6 week. It'll be a 4-week class series investigating kind of this idea of New Year's resolutions from a Buddhist perspective, looking at wise intention, looking at wise effort, and balancing that with where we're at. You can also follow us or check us out on Instagram at One Mind Dharma. And before I get into today's talk, I just want to apologize or give a heads up in advance or ask forgiveness. I've tried to find a good time to record, and I've done my best, but they are doing construction on the lot next to us. And I tried to pick a time that I think it looks like they're on their lunch break. I've been kind of peeking out the window and I saw them start to eat lunch. So I took my time to meditate and now I'm going to record. I don't know how long that will last. So if there is some background noise, I apologize in advance. All right. I think this is a topic that we've discussed or kind of alluded to, or maybe kind of touched tangentially in other talks. It's funny, I was actually looking through the One Mind Dharma website, and a lot of the posts are 13, 14 years old, and I was kind of like searching around for something about this topic of the five aggregates, and I realized it's something that I haven't really talked about or read or written about. And I think that part of this comes from a lack of understanding on my part, a lack of when I started the website and started this podcast, I had, and we'll get into this towards the end, I had like an intellectual understanding of this teaching, but not like, I didn't feel comfortable teaching about it without some actual felt experience, some knowing in the Buddhist sense, this knowing in our bones, not in our brains. And I try not to teach about things that, or I don't try, I'm successful. I don't teach about things that I don't have some experience with. So anyways, I thought it was time to kind of dive into this. So the word that we often hear is skandhas in Sanskrit or khandhas in Pali. And the translation we use in English is the aggregates, the five aggregates. According to, I tried to look up like what the word actually means, because often like the words that we use in Pali or Sanskrit had a meaning outside of Buddhism or before Buddhism. And it looks like, according to Tanjef, that it was Thanissaro Bhikkhu. It was used just as kind of a generic pile, a bundle, a heap, or a mass. So it might be like a pile of leaves. I was going to say a pile of trash, but I don't want to throw that connotation of trash on it. Like pile or heap of something. When the Buddha introduced this teaching or this kind of core concept, which was new to Buddhism, as far as new at the time to spiritual work, he introduced them as the clinging khandhas. And he talked about this in his first sermon. The five aggregates are often taught. I was looking up information on them like I often do, reading through the books I have, searching the web. And it's interesting how many websites especially not so much in books, but in websites, talk about the 5 khandhas are what make up a person. I saw on a website, and I'm not going to name the website, but a big website that said the 5 skandhas are the components that make up our individual self or being. And I thought, whoa, that's news to me. So I dug into that a little bit to see where that came from. And it turns out that the Buddha never said that. That's not kind of a Pali or canonical teaching. It came from another tradition, kind of commentaries in the Theravada school. And I'm probably going to butcher this word, but from the Sarvastivadin tradition, which is an important tradition in the history of Buddhism. And maybe we'll have an episode on kind of the history and transmission of Buddhism over the centuries. But it was an early school of kind of Theravada commentary that kind of gave rise to Mahayana Buddhism and the Mahayana schools. And there's lots of things that from the commentaries that are valuable. I don't mean to say just because it wasn't from the time of the Buddha, it's not valuable. The Visuddhimagga, so many teachings from the Visuddhimagga we use in our tradition, and I find them very useful. But what happened was, because this kind of tradition gave rise to Mahayana, in Mahayana schools, many people subscribe to this interpretation of the aggregates. These are the 5 aggregates that make up self. In Theravada, it's more taught as I saw it phrased as like the 5 heaps that make up experience. So not ourselves, not our being, but experience. And it's taught even more specifically as the things that we cling to, right? We're taught in the 4 Noble Truths that clinging is one of the causes of suffering. Same with the teaching on the 3 poisons. And the aggregates are taught as what we specifically cling to. The Buddha actually said when kind of was asked to define himself or your oneself, that's limiting. It's a limiting idea. And the question, what am I, is just best ignored for awakening. I know that's unsettling sometimes, but I think it's an important instruction that we're not to focus on figuring out what exactly we are, but instead tune into these teachings about suffering and relieving suffering. The Buddha describes these aggregates as burdensome. In the Bhara Sutta, he says, and which is the burden? The 5 clinging aggregates. And he says this in many other suttas, and it's very explicit. The aggregates are kind of burdensome or weighing on us. It's also part of, I think I've given talks on it, I've certainly written about it, the 4 foundations of mindfulness, the Satipatthana, where we're to practice mindfulness of the aggregates. So it's an important teaching. It is a teaching that perhaps isn't as like basic or oh, the word escaped my head, as easily understood or kind of naturally understood as something like the 4 Noble Truths, perhaps. But I think it's an important teaching for understanding specifically the nature of clinging and attachment. So I'm going to go through the 5 aggregates kind of briefly. I'll give some examples, some kind of definitions of them. And then I want to talk about how we actually practice with this teaching. Because a lot of teachings, I don't have a lot of teachings. I think there are myself and a lot of my students that I work with one-on-one have a deep intellectual understanding, like truly understand intellectually in their brains or minds some of these teachings. But the calling from the Buddha wasn't just to read them in a book or listen to the Dhamma and understand it intellectually. It was to actually know it and to experience it. So we're going to talk about what that actually looks like, because I think this is a teaching that can be a little complex or confusing with that. So again, these are the 5 aggregates, the 5 things that we cling to. And I'll read the Pali name and kind of the English translation. The first is, and they are, before I get into it, are listed in an order. Not everything in Buddhism is listed in an order. We know that Buddhism loves the lists. And these are listed in an order often thought to kind of be the most basic or simple to see, all the way to like a little bit more complex. But anyways, we have rupa or form, vedana or feeling tone, sana or perception, sankhara, mental formations or volition, and vijnana, consciousness. So, just to kind of introduce these relatively briefly, the first one, rupa, is often translated as form or physical form. So this is the things that we that's perceived by the senses. And for the sake of this kind of example, we'll use the sense door of the eyes of seeing. So right now, sitting in front of me, I have a little blue Buddha statuette thing that someone gifted me. The rupa, or the form, is the actual item, the actual physical item sitting there. With a sound, it may be the actual sound. With a thought, it may be the actual thought. But it's the actual form. It can also be something internal, right? A feeling of pain in the body, like a tightness or an itch. The second, feeling or vedana, is not a feeling like emotion. It's the feeling tone. It's whether the experience of something is pleasant, unpleasant, or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, which we often translate as just neutral. I think that I've been working on offering a talk on Vedana and scribbling down notes for a long time, and I think it's coming together. But I think Vedana is an interesting one because it often arises non-volitionally and almost instantly tied in with the experience of experiencing something. We have like an itch during meditation, and we find it's unpleasant from the get-go. We take a bite of ice cream and it's pleasant right from the moment of contact. Frankly, before the moment of contact, even just when we see it. So form, feeling, perception, which I've also heard translated as contact. I think Sayadaw Pandita just says contact. So this is the kind of process of sensing and recognizing. So when I see that it's a little like blue Buddha statue. When I see it, that moment of perceiving it and perceiving it as a Buddha statue is perception. The moment where it's kind of contacting my eyes. Then we have mental formation or volition. And this is kind of any mental formation that comes up. So it might be like a narrative, an emotional experience, some concept or thought, choices. And some translators call it volition or even volitional formation because choice or intention have a big power here to shape experience. So like using the example of having an itch during meditation, right? We have the form, the actual physical sensation of an itch, the feeling tone of it being unpleasant, the perception, it enters our awareness and we perceive it as, oh, that's an itch. We might like assign a label to it, itch. And the mental formation comes when we begin thinking, ooh, I don't like that, aversion, right? Or I'm going to scratch it so I can relieve it. Mahasi Sayadaw actually really recommends focusing on, and we'll get into practical instructions, but focusing on intention during meditation when we intend to do something, because it is a good look at this mental formation. And then the last one is consciousness, being aware of the experience. We're often perceiving things and having Vedana and even mental formations without really being conscious of it. So in that moment when I'm conscious of seeing this Buddha on my desk, or I'm conscious, oh, I'm experiencing physical felt sense with the itch, that's consciousness. I think it's important that one of the teachings here is that consciousness is not self or our true nature. Consciousness only exists, as far as this teaching goes, in relation to something. So, for example, we talk about eye consciousness. You might be conscious that you're seeing right now. That's consciousness. But it's not self, or it's not your true nature. And it's kind of easy to see how we can cling to these things. And we'll get to that in a moment. But I want to offer an example from one of my favorite books that I quote nearly every week, The Manual of Insight from Mahasi Sayadaw. And he uses different translations here of the terms. So I'm going to include the translations I'm using in my talk as well. So he says, when the visible form that has been seen draws one attention, one is mainly aware of the visual object or form. If one notices the mental state of seeing, one is realizing eye consciousness. If the contact between one's eye and the visual object is clear, then one is experiencing mental contact or perception. If one finds the object to be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral, one is experiencing feeling. And then he goes on in the next paragraph to describe the mental formations that may arise, the thoughts. In the suttas, from kind of a more traditional standpoint, they're defined really in terms of their function. Form wears down or deteriorates, feeling feels, perception labels or identifies, mental formations or perception, or excuse me, mental formation or volitional formation is attends to or evaluates, and consciousness cognizes is kind of how it's taught. So these are they're not just kind of I don't think it's important to necessarily remember that aspect, but to recognize that they're processes. They're compared in the suttas, and there's a lot of suttas that kind of use the metaphor of fire, but they're compared to fuel. In the fire sermon, the aggregates are kind of compared to like a heap of burning sticks, like fuel for a fire. And the fire is the three poisons, the three main causes of suffering: craving, aversion, and delusion. The word itself that we use as clinging in English, upadana in Pali, literally means like feeding or to feed, like as into fuel. And the word nirvana in Sanskrit or nibbana in Pali literally means extinguishment, like to extinguish. So these aggregates are kind of the fuel that keeps the fire of craving, aversion, and delusion going. Ton Jeff says, instead of using them, referring to the five aggregates, instead of using them for the purpose of constructing a self, we use them for the purpose of creating a path to the end of suffering. Instead of carrying piles of bricks on our shoulders, we take them off and lay them along the ground as pavement. And I love this kind of imagery of taking this burdensome heap of the aggregates off our shoulders that's weighing us down or causing suffering and laying it down as pavement, as a path. We can actually use our understanding of these aggregates and the nature of clinging as a vehicle for awakening rather than a hindrance. And an example of this can be seen in the teachings on concentration or absorption or jhana. We use form like the breath to attain a perception using directed thought, right? We're using the breath, which is form, to attain this kind of perception of sensing and recognizing the breath through mental formation, through volition. And as we develop our concentration and fall into the jhanas, we actually begin kind of letting go of the aggregates. And we talked about this before with the factors of concentration, with the first two being vitakka and vichara, the application of thought and the sustained thought. Although those serve as a great tool for developing concentration, as we get into deeper states of concentration and move into the second jhana, you actually let go of the initial application and sustained application. One of the ways I've heard this phrased is the state is born out of concentration rather than effort. And what's happening is we're actually letting go of the form of the breath, the clinging to the form. We're letting go of the clinging of the perception of it. We're allowing the concentration to be there without the effort, without the volition or mental formation. And I know that may sound, I know the first time I heard teachings like that, I was like, what is this person talking about? It's okay. It's why I held off on teaching the five aggregates myself for many years. But the point remains that Tan Jeff shares. We're not to shun the aggregates or to deny them, but to actually learn to relate to them in a way that doesn't cause suffering is the teaching. And we can see how clinging really is related to or surrounding these aggregates, right? We cling to form quite clearly. We cling to our bodies as our own. I didn't write this down or plan to use this in today's talk, but in Food for Thought from Ajahn Chah, he's talking about the meditation hall that they built, the monks, and I assume some people who knew what they were doing. And he said, we identify this as our meditation hall because we sit here every day. We sit here for many hours. It's built for the purpose of our meditation practice and the Dhamma. But there's also countless other creatures that call it home, right? The snakes, the spiders, the rats. I don't remember what animal specifically he named. And we like chase them out thinking it's our meditation hall. But is it really our meditation hall? If they live here too, it's theirs just as much as ours. This idea of clinging that this is our meditation hall really only causes suffering. So it might be like our bodies. We really cling to it as a sense of self. We really kind of hold on to it and resist the change that happens. You might cling to this form of somebody else or something else. We cling to sounds. As I mentioned, we're having construction next door. And this whole where we live is just a big limestone bed, and they're digging out a basement, which is pretty rare here. But they're like drilling through like just a bed of limestone, and it's not that close to our house, but it's like trembling our house, and the sound is uh, strong. I'll say there's some clinging to the form of silence. We cling to the feeling tone, right? We cling to the pleasant or unpleasant, or even the neutral, maybe the pleasant and unpleasant a bit more. We attach ourselves to like that sound or the sensation of the construction next door is unpleasant. When it arises, it's unpleasant, and I'm like stuck in that. We cling to the feeling of pleasant when we eat ice cream. We crave it, right? Then when we have a craving for a sweet like that, in a sense, we're craving or clinging to the feeling tone. We cling to perceptions. This is we cling to perceptions so much. My my mom clings to perceptions really strongly. I have I may have told this story, but I had some kids that like I wouldn't say they bullied me because I was very fortunate to not be on the receiving end of, too horrible of bullying, but they were mean to me. They were, they had moments when we were in like 6th or 7th grade when I was 11 or 12 years old. And I hadn't seen them for like 15 years. And I was back visiting. I was with my wife, my girlfriend at the time, and we were visiting my parents, getting a coffee, and they were standing there. And they recognized me first. I hadn't seen them, in 10, 12 years or something. They recognized me first, and they came right up and were like, "Oh man, we were so, mean to you in middle school, and like we have no excuse. I feel bad about it all the time of like the way I treated people, and it weighs on me, and I just wanted to apologize that, I would never treat someone like that today, and I realized the harm I may have caused, and I know of an apology, like just a super 10 out of 10 genuine apology. I went home to back to my parents' house to my mom was there, and I told her, "Oh, I ran into, X and Y at Pete's Coffee, and they gave me this apology for how brutal they were to me in middle school." And my mom said, "Oh, they were always bad kids. They're probably bad now, and I don't like them. Never liked them. Bad family, that kind of thing." It's like, whoa. Let's let go of this kind of clinging of the perception we have of these are bad people or bad kids, which I don't believe in anyways, but we can see how we cling so tightly to our labeling or our story that we have about something. I've never been a fan of the holiday season. I was raised in a family where my mom's family was Catholic, my dad's family is Jewish, and we celebrated both Hanukkah and Christmas. And it was always kind of like just a stressful time. I don't know. It wasn't my favorite time of year. And I've had this perception, this kind of innate perception that is not necessarily volitional of like, oh, holiday season stressful or bad even. And I cling to that regardless of how well something goes or how much joy there is. I'm like stuck clinging in that perception. And these perceptions are impermanent and subject to change. Since having kids, especially as they've gotten a little bit older, not infants, the holiday season is really beautiful. It's kind of like brought back the magic to have, we have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old. We cling to formations and thought processes. I think that we cling to one of the ways I see it most strongly in my own life is to thought patterns, right? When something happens, something happened. Oh, we went to go renew our children's passports Monday, a couple days ago now, and a renewal is easier than a first application, but they were their Mexican passports, and because our kids were born here and are Mexican citizens, um, and we're not. We're American citizens. I'm working on my Mexican citizenship, but it requires a little bit of extra paperwork. So we went and we checked in at the passport office, gave them all the documents. They said, okay, we'll call you. And then, like, a bunch of people checked in behind us. All of them got called first. And we were sitting there for like 2.5 hours with a 4 and 6-year-old. And the thought patterns arose very clearly in that moment, the kind of catastrophizing, or like it's the worst case scenario, right? Like there's something wrong with the documents or whatever. And I see that kind of thought pattern happen quite a bit. I like cling to it. But there's also volition or choice there. Like, oh, I'm not going to like engage in that completely. Turns out what the reason they take longer is because we have some foreign documents they have to verify, which takes a little bit more time. Perfectly reasonable. They have to, like, we have to have translations of everything. It takes a little bit more time. We cling to the thought processes as a sense of self, like, very clearly. I'm an angry person. I'm an anxious person. I'm a happy person. I'm a sarcastic or lighthearted or whatever it may be. We identify with it. And then consciousness, I think we cling to our consciousness quite a bit as who we are, right? This kind of person either in the control room or in kind of the observation tower watching everything happen as the true sense of self. The part of us that's seeing the Buddha statue on our desk or hearing the music, that consciousness is who we are. And the teaching here is that that is not who we are. It's actually impermanent. It's impermanent and it's not self. And we can see this, like, sticking with the consciousness in this moment, or in the moment I just referenced a few moments ago. I'm conscious of speaking. I'm conscious, I have ear consciousness of my own voice. It's unpleasant. In this moment, I'm conscious of, I'm looking out the window and we have a beautiful little garden with flowers blooming right now. Consciousness is constantly changing, and the state of consciousness is changing. Your consciousness is not the same when you're awake as when you're asleep, as when you're fresh in the morning or tired in the afternoon. When you're happy or sad. It's a dramatic example, but your consciousness is not the same as when you're sober as when you've taken something like LSD. Consciousness is impermanent and changing. To cling to it as self is delusion. The mental formations and thought processes, equally so. They're constantly changing, as are the perception or the forms or the feeling tones. It's actually a common chanting that's done at monasteries. I can't remember if it was Wat Metta in Southern California, which is Tan Jeff's monastery, or Abhayagiri up in Northern California, where every morning they chanted, it was in Pali, but they chanted, form is impermanent, feeling is impermanent, perception is impermanent, mental formations are impermanent, sense consciousness is impermanent. Form is not self, feeling is not self, perception is not self, mental formations are not self, sense consciousness is not self. All conditions are transient. There's no self in the created or the uncreated. I found that translation online. I think it might be offered at many monasteries, but it was literally offered every morning because it's such an important reminder for us to keep in mind. So just to recap before we move into actually practicing, these are the 5 kind of heaps or piles. And they're called that because like form is a heap or pile, right? There's so many different forms of form. There's physical things that we might touch or see. There's sounds that we might hear with our ears, thoughts, smells, tastes. And they're the things that we create a sense of self around erroneously. Or in Mahayana traditions, they make up the self. I find the teaching, I don't usually kind of pick sides between two different teachings, but on this, as I think a lot of people know, I mostly follow a Theravada kind of outlook, but I do read quite a bit of like Thich Nhat Hanh and a little bit of Zen. But in this case, I really think the 5 aggregates are the things that make up experience and that we kind of erroneously create a sense of self around. And we cling to them. And it's not necessarily the easiest thing that we to see on the path as far as suffering. Like it's a lot easier to see sometimes how aversion causes suffering, right? Something going back to the itch in the body, it's really clear to see how that not wanting it to be there is a moment of suffering. So, how do we actually look at this and get to know this? In the Manual of Insight, where Mahasi Sayadaw talks about the 5 aggregates and working with them, he points out that noting every aggregate every time they arise would be like a totally chaotic and busy meditation. You wouldn't even be able to notice the present moment. You'd have gaps and be missing things. Like if you're sitting in meditation and an itch arises, to try to note all the 5 aggregates kind of working together and arising and arising and passing, you're going to be far behind the present time experience. So the recommendation from many teachers is not to actually do that, but to notice the sense door, to notice with the itch in meditation, for example, feeling and maybe unpleasant, or maybe feeling and like the actual physical, the forms, and the perception of it, itch, just noting itch. But here's my tips for beginning to work with the 5 aggregates. And understand that this is a slow process for many. First, understand it intellectually and then let it go. This is not a teaching that you can think your way into true understanding. I think that by reading about it or listening to Dharma talks about it, we can grow to kind of know what to look for or be familiar enough with it that we can access the information or perspective or understanding during meditation. But like many Buddhist teachings, this is just not something that we can intellect our way into. We have to actually know it through our experience. So try to gain an understanding intellectually, but also watch out for like a striving. Like I find myself over the years, not just with the 5 aggregates, but with many practices, like sitting in meditation and striving so hard to practice exactly how I read in a book or exactly how I heard in a Dharma talk. And the striving or the kind of tightening and the trying to remember the whole list in my head makes it a meditation that's just monkey mind, to say the least. We have to actually loosen a little bit. I did this with when I first read the Satipatthana book, The Direct Path to Realization. I had like notes. I really wanted to understand it. And then when I would sit to practice, it was like very, very structured and kind of tactical. And I think this can be helpful in some way, but also we end up limiting ourselves in another way. So seek to understand this teaching intellectually and then kind of let it go. The second thing I'd say is develop concentration. There's really no substitute in insight meditation for a deep concentrative state. As we grow kind of more serene, it's kind of a cliche word, but as we grow more serene or peaceful in our meditation, things kind of slow down in a sense, and things like the five aggregates or the poisons or how we're interacting or experiencing the world just kind of become clear more naturally. In a sense, once we develop concentration, we don't have to work to notice the aggregates. They just kind of come into our awareness. Of course, if we have an understanding of them intellectually. But by developing concentration, we put our minds and bodies into a state where we're supporting our own awakening. We're most able to notice the presence of these aggregates as they arise and pass. I heard when I first got sober back in 2010, I went on a bunch of retreats, Vipassana retreats with Goenka, not with Goenka, but with his organization. And then I went on my first retreat with Against the Stream Meditation Center, and Noah was teaching, Noah Levine? I don't remember how to say his name anymore. With Noah, and he was talking about the five aggregates, and he jokingly said something like, the five aggregates known as Noah, or that we call Noah. Which kind of brings me to this next tip, which is the power of language, right? We're not going to walk around all day speaking in a way that is tied in with ultimate truth rather than conventional reality. But you might try switching up the language. When you're in meditation and you experience, we'll say, pain in your knee, instead of saying, my knee hurts in your head, you might switch the language to be a little bit more tied in with conventional truth, with ultimate truth. And instead of saying my knee hurts, you might note, oh, there's pain in the knee. You could go further with this and say, there is a knee. It is experiencing a sensation that is unpleasant. It's being perceived as pain. And there's some felt physical consciousness, as well as mental formations about what caused this pain and so on. I don't think we need to go overboard like that, but we can switch the language just kind of subtly or gently. Thich Nhat Hanh talks about this a lot, as do many of his monks when we've sat at Deer Park Monastery, that instead of, oh, I'm angry, or even I'm experiencing anger, because that's identifying with it and clinging to it just kind of inherently with the language. Instead, oh, there's anger. You've probably heard this in talks or in meditations, perhaps thinking nothing of it. But it's this act of kind of not identifying with the aggregate, recognizing that it's not self. There's anger or there's anxiety. Oh, the mind is thinking. So you can switch the language you use a little bit, just as kind of an offering or an orientation towards tuning into the not self nature of these aggregates. You might try specifically sitting in meditation with one of the aggregates, the way we do in like an anapanasati meditation or breath, mindfulness of the breath, or even concentration in a sense. We're really sitting with the experience of form, the aggregate of form. One of my favorite practices that, as far as mindfulness goes, that like I really enjoy for some reason is just tuning into Vedana. I wouldn't say just tuning into Vedana, but tuning into like the experience and then the feeling tone. So I do this during walking meditation. I do it during the day when I'm out. I do it in formal sitting meditation. So you might like rest with an open awareness and note hearing, pleasant, feeling in the body, pleasant, thought, unpleasant. And in this way, practicing with Vedana, we really get to know the nature of feeling tone, that it is impermanent, that it comes and goes, it arises and passes. It's not, there's non-self in it. We can, of course, do this with perception. We can do it with mental formations, tuning into kind of mindfulness of thought or even mental states, and of consciousness. I think the two that really lend themselves most basically are rupa or form and Vedana. I was writing a post for the mindful counselor about body scans, and I saw an interesting study. I think it was at Massachusetts General Hospital. It was, I forget what journal it was published in. It was a peer-reviewed journal. The post was, or the article about the study was in the Harvard Gazette, and it was I can't remember the researcher's name. They put individuals doing body scan meditations into fMRIs, and the ones that were, it was really interesting. Some were doing relaxation focused body scans, so like going from one part of the body to the other and volitionally relaxing it. And those people were strengthening kind of, they were found to be strengthening these connections in the brain that were associated with deliberate control, I think was the term used. And there was a group doing more awareness-based body scans, they called it. So like a traditional insight body scan, where we're just moving through the body, noting what's going on in the experience there, not seeking to change anything. And what they found in this second group was that they were strengthening or building this ability to feel sensations in the body. Almost, I think the term that the researcher used was sensitizing oneself. So I've never really heard that term. I've heard desensitizing, but sensitizing oneself. And we can see this with, if you've meditated for some time, crazy things start happening that we don't expect. I was talking with Elizabeth about this last night, of like the sensitizing, and she said, yeah, like drinking coffee. And I was like, yeah, because we both drink like a cup of coffee in the morning, but we used to drink a few cups of coffee a day. Now if I do that, I'm a little sensitive to it. I feel it. Now when I have some irritability, I feel it in my body before I'm in rage. So just by practicing being aware of something, we kind of sensitize ourselves to see it and can, or experience it, and we can experience it more easily in the future. So that whole story brings me to the next tip, which is to know when they're present. You don't need to seek them out, but to know when they're present. I've told this story, I feel like I tell this story once every 4 episodes, but it was one of the kind of most profound and simple but profound experiences I've had on a meditation retreat. I was on the 30-day insight retreat at Spirit Rock, back in 2014 maybe. And I was sitting, I don't remember how many days we were in, but like halfway through, I'll say, deep enough that like my mindfulness and concentration had really developed. And I was sitting in the meditation hall, beautiful meditation hall at Spirit Rock. I think it was like spring, like February or March. Lovely weather. They had the windows open. And as I was sitting there, a bird chirped outside or sang. And I noticed in my head, I had this kind of like image of a bird, which I am not a bird watcher or ornithologist. I mean, I love nature, but I have no idea what kind of bird it was. But in my head, I had this image of a bird. Perhaps accurate, probably not. And I had this genuine moment of curiosity or interest of, whoa, that happened like so fast. How did that happen? And it was a real like understanding of the five aggregates in that moment. Of what happened was there was a sound of the bird, the form. There was a Vedana or feeling tone of pleasantness. I found it was a very pleasant song. There was the perception, right? Like that's a bird. Like I knew my brain immediately, as fast as the Vedana or feeling tone came up, my mind went bird. That's a bird. Like we don't necessarily have to think about it always or figure it out. It's right there. It almost arises with the actual contact. And then the mental formations of there was some mental formation there of wanting to know what kind of bird it was, and then followed by like a creation of an image in my head, like a quite literal visual mental formation. And then finally, there was the consciousness at the end of all that. I'm aware not just of ear consciousness, but of thought consciousness, that this thought or mental formation is arising. And of course, as we practice these, like it doesn't always happen like clear and in a line like that, as we might be conscious of multiple different sense doors working at the same time. But just like that in meditation practice, when we notice it, when we really look at it, we're sensitizing ourselves, and it becomes easier to see the next time. If you've had some period or some time meditating or doing yoga or the other thought that comes to mind is I crochet and macrame. And I know now so much better when I've made like a bad knot or a bad stitch. I know immediately, I know probably before I even actually pull the stitch through that it's going to be a bad stitch. I know I don't do a lot of yoga, but I know when I go into a yoga pose, as I'm going into it, there's like a sense of, oh, this isn't right. I know it at the gym with my trainer that when I start to do that deadlift, this isn't right, and I start over. As we practice something and as we really notice these aggregates, it becomes much easier to notice their presence and impermanent nature and non-self with less effort. So I try to keep my talks under an hour, and we're about there. So I do want to wrap up. But I think that the important things, I feel like ChatGPT, I'm going to like draw a conclusion here. In conclusion, I think the important things to remember or to take from this talk is, first of all, as with any Dharma talk, anything that reaches out to you or like really kind of piques your interest or rings true in your heart, start there. Start there. The other thing that I think is important, or I want to impart from my own practice and experience, is what the five aggregates are, the form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. And the focus that these are the aspects of our experience that we cling to or create a false sense of self out of. So I encourage you to look, not to get stuck in the intellectual understanding, but to let go of that, develop some concentration, and begin to just be aware of how these five aggregates play a role in the clinging and the sense of self we create. Often just by recognizing them and recognizing the kind of becoming or clinging that's happening with them, we unhook ourselves from them. I remember James Barris telling me that several times on that same retreat. Just notice whatever it was. Just notice it. You don't have to do anything in this moment. We can discuss kind of choice or volition and responding differently down the line. But for now, just notice them, be with them, and see what happens. So know when these aggregates are kind of present and playing a role, and observe them, keeping in mind the impermanent and not self nature. I'm going to include in the show notes a sutta, as well as I found a study guide from Access to Insight on the khandas, or the aggregates. That is like a little bit dense, perhaps, and contains a lot of suttas, but it is an interesting read if this is something that interests you. And it's free. If you have any questions, you can email me at matthew@oneminddharma.com. And the challenge is at oneminddharma.com/challenge. The Begin Again New Year's course is at oneminddharma.com/New Year. And visit us on YouTube or Instagram at oneminddharma. And with that, I wish you a happy week.